And, last night I spent about... Can people hear me at the back? Yeah? Tell me if I'm not audible. I used to speak very softly, but I learned how to be a moderate screamer given my profession. So last night I was spending about an hour crafting a message to the community about Israel being under attack. And I even put Psalm 121 in Hebrew and English so we can all take a minute in La La Land to think about our brothers and sisters and to consider making a pledge to our Israel Relief Fund, 100% of the proceeds of which go to worthy causes in Israel. There's a lot of destruction. Kids grow up with trauma, and it's just very hard. So we think about that, right? It's like the great Sephardic poet Yehuda Halevi, Judah Halevi, who was also a great philosopher, wrote in one of his poems, I am in the furthermost west. He was in Spain. That's as west as they knew back then. Yet my heart resides all the way back east. And I think it's true for all of us in terms of our brothers and sisters in Israel and also our countries of origins that we had to leave in very trying circumstances. So we think about our brothers and sisters tonight, and we understand that the chat that we're having tonight is a way to deepen our understanding of the complexity of the most notoriously intense and complicated political conflict on earth, probably, the Arab-Israeli conflict. So hopefully this will widen the scope of our understanding of what is going on in Israel, what is going on between Israel and its neighbors, and hopefully also empower our children/grandchildren, depending on the age ranges, given the vehement anti-Israel that our children and grandchildren are being exposed to, even in Westwood at UCLA, right? I was just showing...
Is it going through the
yeah, and I was just showing Alex the other night how the Student Justice for Palestine with the so-called Jewish Voice for Peace are going to hold a rally equating those murdered in Pittsburgh with fatalities in Gaza. So we have a lot of work to do. We need to protect our children. We need to empower our children. And we need to appreciate the miracle, the wonder, the uniqueness that's called Israel. And nobody puts it better than Jonathan Sacks. You know, I'm a big fan of Rabbi Sacks. And he defines Israel. It's very beautiful. Check it out. He says, Israel is the victory of possibility over probability. The probability after the Holocaust, for some people, may well have been that there would be no Jewish people. They would just, remain a scattered people and gradually assimilate and vanish. But of course, we are an Am Olam, an eternal people, and we have achieved a feat that no nation achieved in history and no nation ever will. Coming back home territorially after 20 centuries. So we're going to jump in. I prepared a little source sheet for us because, the material is very significant, but I want to make it a little breezy and interesting and hopefully a little funny and good taste, so it's not like tedious or anything like that. So in the yeshiva world, or actually, I'll give an example from the Hasidic world. There's a story about somebody who had a brilliant mind, and he studied the entire Babylonian Talmud. There are people who study a page a day, it's called Daf Yomi, and after some 7 years they complete the entirety of the Babylonian Talmud. And then you have parties all over the world, like at Yankee Stadium. You see tens of thousands of people celebrating that they finished learning the whole Talmud. It's an incredible accomplishment. And so this guy comes up, a little pompous, to the Baal Shem Tov, this great mystic, and tells him, Rabbi, I just went through the entire Talmud. So the rabbi looked at him and he said, that's great, but did the Talmud go through you? In other words, did you just have an external experience with the text, or did the text enter you and fill your being and emanate you? Did it alter your very way of thinking and feeling in the world? And that's what we're supposed to do with Jewish texts, right? The Talmud says, God forbid that a person should read the prayer book as if he's reading Igeret, as if he's reading a letter or an email, right? That's not how we approach Jewish texts. So, another story in the yeshiva world is that you always have to do what they call in the American yeshivas chazara, which is Jewish American Hebrew for chazara, for review. Got to do a little review. So for those of you who were not here last time on Dynasty, we did a little bit of the early days. Okay, so page 1. Abraham was the first real estate broker who bought a piece of land for the Jewish people in Israel in Hebron, not to be confused with the gas station Chevron. Isaac stayed in Israel the whole time. He didn't even go to Kabul. He was very frustrated. Jacob, towards the end of the book of Genesis, immigrates to Egypt because there is a famine in Israel. The Dow Jones collapsed. He goes with his children and grandchildren. That's the descent into Egypt, the servitude. Moses/Joshua bring us back to Israel. Source 2. King David, the historical figure, not the hotel in Jerusalem, conquers Jerusalem. His son, King Solomon, builds the first temple. King David wanted to build the temple, but God told him, your hands are full of blood. You're a military man, right? You're Rambo or Robocop. You've done too much war. Your son will build the temple because he's a philosopher, he's a scholar, he's a man of thought. It's more befitting for that kind of temperament, that kind of person, to build God's home in this world. After Solomon dies, his son does a very lousy job keeping the country going. He raises taxes big time. I'm actually serious. Even though his advisors told him not to. Shalom, Dalia, welcome. And Israel splits into two. Right? A la North Korea, South Korea, lehavdil. The northern kingdom is the 10 tribes that disappeared. People talk about the lost 10 tribes. The other 2 tribes down south are Binyamin and Yehuda. Okay? So Benjamin, we are all descendants of these 2 tribes, Binyamin and Yehuda. The other 10 kind of disappeared. Maybe the Ethiopians used to be part of the 10. We know the Pashtun tribes, there are now Al-Qaeda, a little removed from Judaism, but some of these people, their grandparents had names like Menashe and such. They may have been... So, when did this happen? When did the 10 tribes get kicked out of Israel and disappear? That's source 3. In the 8th century, 722 BCE. Now we're left with just 2 tribes. That's us, ladies and gentlemen. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, destroys King Solomon's temple in source 4 and exiles the political, spiritual, intellectual, financial elite. He leaves in Israel the so-called common people. But we have good news, right? Cyrus comes. And Cyrus, as the head of the Persian Empire, the Persian Empire takes on as the power over the Babylonian Empire. And they both want the same thing, the Babylonians and the Persians. What do they want? They want taxes from their colonies. They want money. But Cyrus is smarter. He says, I'm going to give them the carrot. Religious minorities, Jews, you can go back to Israel. You can build your temple. As long as you're good boys and girls and you pay me taxes, read my lips, then you can go back. And then we go back and build the second temple. And you have the year that the return started, which is in source 4, 538. I wrote CE, that's minus. Right, it's BC, so I didn't make a mistake. Good. Before the Common Era. And if you want to read about it in the Holy Bible, it's in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Verse 5, the Chanukah Wars, right? Chanukah is coming up. Hanukkah? Sorry, I'm learning here. So Hanukkah was in the 160s BCE. That was the Syrian Greek Empire wanted to destroy not the Jewish people physically, like the Nazis, but Judaism, the practice of Judaism. You can remain alive. Just stop with the nonsense of worshiping a spiritual infinite God. Be like everybody else. Worship your body, sanctify the material world, and bow before statues. And we didn't agree to that, and we won the war, and that's why we celebrate it. It's a larger discussion, but I just wanted to throw that date. Okay? The 160s before the Common Era, that's the Chanukah Wars. Source 6. The Roman Empire comes as the new empire of the day. The Roman Empire takes control in Israel when? Minus 63 BCE. The Romans come in. And at some point, we had enough of the pagan Roman rule over Israel. So we tried to revolt, which is a little bit like Albania trying to fight against the United States. It wasn't the best idea. There were zealots who forced us into the war. The moderates didn't want to go into that war. That's when the Second Temple was destroyed by Rome, and that was in the year 70. Still source 6. Masada, since we all like to go there for a trip, or we may have been there, Masada was a remnant of people who didn't want to surrender even after the temple was lost. That was in the year 73. They committed mass suicide. And that could ruin your whole day. Source 7. Bar Kokhba revolt. That's 132 to 136. Again, we say, you know what? Let's overthrow the Roman Empire. The years... Dr. Farzam, I have a handout for you. Okay? Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hush your money. Yeah. Okay. So, 132 to 136, and that's when we were exiled from Israel. When people talk about almost 2,000 years of the Jews not being in Israel, being scattered all over the world, that's when it starts, friends. Verse 7. The years 133 to 136, we try to overthrow the Romans. Now the Romans really had it with us. So they rename Israel Palestina. Sorry, I get so excited. I really like Judaism. So they changed the name of the area from Yehuda, Judea, to Palestina. That's where the name comes from. Okay?
Why? Wait, what is that?
Oh, bonjour tout le monde. 136 BCE. I'm sorry, my mistake. 136 CE of the Common Era. Okay? So the Romans did it because they were smart. Because they know that the names that you give to places, they define how people are going to think, the consciousness about that place. Right? So they call it Palestina. And Jerusalem, they turned into Ilia Capitolina. Okay?
But why Palestina?
Palestina, excellent question. Because of the Philistines of the Bible, which were a nomadic commercial tribe that used to come from the Greek islands like Crete, and they settled in coasts. So they settled where Gaza is today, serendipitously, and Ashdod and Ashkelon, all the cities that are now being bombed by Hamas. And they were commercial tribes. But by the time the Romans renamed Israel Palestina, the Philistines were no longer an existing ethnic group. But they wanted a name that is completely severed from Jewish association. By the way, when Arafat used to say that the Palestinians are the descendants of the Philistines, complete baloney. It's completely different ethnicity. Now we're really getting to Zionism, right? By the way, do you have a watch?
Yes.
Anybody has a watch? I can... like a hand watch.
What do you need?
I just need a little hand watch so I can kind of time myself. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Simon. Very good.
Very expensive.
Okay. I'll be careful. 25 tonight. Okay, very good. We'll see what we can do in 25 minutes. Does that sound fair? 25 minutes? Okay. Source 8. That's what we said last time. Zionism, anti-Zionism, Zionist. Zion means Jerusalem, Zion. So when you say somebody is a Zionist, you mean he's a Jerusalemite. What does that mean? It means that this person believes that the Jewish people have the right to their own place under the sun in their historic homeland in Israel. Zion is Yerushalayim. It's another word for Yerushalayim in the Bible is Zion. So now Zionism is the name for the Jewish national movement. For 2,000 years, we were a politically passive people, right? And we lived in different parts of the world, and we didn't try to really change our political fate, right? We were minorities wherever we were. Suddenly, in the 1880s, after the pogroms in Russia, because at that point in time, most of the Jews of the world were in Eastern Europe. It's right before Jews started moving to America. You know, there were very few Jews in America as well. They said, you know what? It's actually more paradoxical than that. The people who founded Israel, people like Herzl, right? Herzl is the best example. They were actually assimilated Europeans. And they spoke 6, 7 European languages. And they wrote plays and books. They were the ultimate Europeans. But guess what happened to them? The French told them, you're not really French. You know, ethnically, you're not French. You can't really be part of the French nation. And in Germany and everybody else, they got that message that they don't really belong. So that ethnic rejection, coupled with the pogroms, those outbursts of sporadic violence against Jews, prompted Zionism. And most of the early Zionists who came to Israel in the 1880s and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century came rejecting Jewish religious practice at home, but they still had this sense of religious vocation that in Israel they're going to build an ideal society like the kibbutz, where everybody shares everything, and we are going to become a light unto the nation, unto the world, unto the nations, by creating this wonderful, just society, equal society, right? So that was the early days. But if you look at the numbers, it wasn't that pretty. At the very bottom of 9, the first Aliyah, 25,000 people came, half of which came from Yemen. Where is Shalom Adoni? Yeah, okay. Rahab, who gave a beautiful talk about Yemenite Jewry in one of our Friday night dinners. Thank you, sir. So Rav is much more knowledgeable about this, but the Yemenites were amongst the first to come. Only 5,000 stayed. That's what I want you to take with you. 25,000 people came to Israel, only 5,000 people stayed. You know why? No Netflix, no Postmates, swamps. It was a terrible place to live, right? And most left during World War I. Let's turn to the next side of the page. Are we having fun? Great. Okay. The third Aliyah, you have the years. The fourth Aliyah, notice that by the 20s and 30s, we're starting to get numbers. We're starting to get numbers, right? That's what Tomer wants to see at work. The numbers getting up. The numbers getting up.
But Herzl doesn't see any of this.
What?
Herzl
died in 1904. Yeah. So he only set the political foundations in motion.
So he saw all 25,000 go, but almost all of them come back.
Right.
He thought it was a failure, probably.
He was a visionary, and he wrote in his journal in 1897, when he convened the first Zionist Congress, that in 5 to 50 years there's going to be a Jewish state. But if he would say it out loud, people would institutionalize him. Guess what? 50 years to the dot, 1947, UN partition plan. So he was really prophetic. And he looked like a prophet, you know, with that beard and gazing deep eyes. He was extraordinarily charismatic. People were ecstatic wherever he visited. So notice how the numbers go up. The fourth Aliyah in the 20s, 80,000, and only 10,000 leave. And even though they're still largely European Aliyah, we're starting to get more people from the Middle East, Yemen, Iraq. Fifth Aliyah, about 250,000. What happened in the 20s and 30s that suddenly we're getting these big numbers? Anti-Semitism. The 250,000 people in the 30s, much of it is German Jews. and Polish Jews. They're starting to feel the soil burning under their feet, right? So, we had I want you to ponder this fact, that 600,000 Jews were in Israel when Israel was established in 1948 and fought its war of independence. 600,000. Most of them were people who came in the 20s and 30s escaping Nazism, fascism in Europe, or coming after the Holocaust. And that's a big secret we're now learning. In other words, most of the Jews who came to Israel came because of Hitler, or fleeing Hitler. Up until after I'm talking about before the state was born, not after. Up until after the Holocaust, Zionism was far from being a consensus in the Jewish world. There were people who had this quasi-delusional idea that we can go back to Israel and maintain our sovereignty. But, most Jews pursued other avenues. The Holocaust was the checkmate of the legitimacy and imperative of the Zionist cause. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, great. So let's go, in the interest of time, let's go to source 11. The UN Partition Plan, 1947. We're fighting with the Arabs all the time. They have a bunch of intifadas in the 20s and 30s against the Jews of land of Israel at the time. And finally, the Brits say, we can't handle these two kids, so to speak, the Jews and the Arabs in Israel. Let's take it to the UN. Even though the UN was back in Queens, and who wants to go to Queens if the UN can be in Midtown Manhattan? But it was in Flushing Meadows where they have the US Open. In any event, they went to the UN and they needed 2/3 majority for this plan to be ratified. And they got it. And now I want you to go to the first map, the second page. Yes.
Wait till you're done.
No, go ahead.
Oh, it's back up to, Rabbi, it's back up to the fifth Aliyah, the 30s and 39.
Yeah.
So the Nuremberg laws, the intolerable acts.
Right, 1935.
Right. So.
Big impetus.
At what, so that was a big, but at what, the question always is, why didn't more flee?
You know why?
Is it because they just.
I'll tell you why. That's my opinion.
Okay.
Because there was a great Jewish philosopher, Hannah Arendt. She was a German Jew, a great woman. And she wrote about anti-Semitism with a quote that I find is very powerful. She said, normal people don't know that everything is possible. So a normal person in the 30s cannot imagine gas chambers. I had family in Germany, right? On my father's side. And my grandfather said, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to Israel. And his father said to everybody else in the family, anybody who gives my son money to go to Israel, if anything happens, his blood is on your hands. What are you going to do in Israel? Pave roads in the blazing sun? And they said, Hitler is just another Haman. He's just, it's very tragic. But let's go to 1947. 1947. The UN offers this partition plan, okay? So the Arab state is in the, what is it, pink? I'm kind of colorblind.
Right.
And the blue is for us. Or as some people say, is for us, right? So look, that was supposed to be the Jewish state. Not a very cannibal state, right? You see those places where, that was... Had the Arabs been politically savvy, they would have grabbed this. But as Golda Meir used to say, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So they attacked us. And it's very chilling that the night that the UN partition plan was passed, thousands of Jews in Israel took to the streets to dance, and only Ben Gurion was sitting very somber and still in his living room. And Shimon Peres, who was then, he was 25 years old, to ask Ben Gurion, why is he so pensive and serious and somber? So Ben Gurion told him in Hebrew, Hayom em rokdim, machar yishafech dam. Today they're dancing, tomorrow blood will be shed. Now 1948, Israel's War of Independence was the most deadly war in Israel's history. 1% of the population perished. 6,000 from 600,000. But it was a miraculous victory, right? Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinians from within. And, the plan was really to slaughter the Jews and to take over their property. And we talk about the Palestinian refugees. Some of them were told by Arab radio, leave, and once we are done with the Zionists, come back victorious. Others left because they were made to leave. But the bottom line is that between 600 and 750,000 Palestinians left Israel during that war. But the Jews who had to leave Islamic lands because life was no longer tenable for them in Arab and Islamic land is close to 1 million. More Jews had to leave their homes as a result of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Another thing people don't know is that we lost the old city of Jerusalem, right, where the Kotel is. We only got that in 1967. There were thousands of Jews living in the old city of Jerusalem. What did the Arabs do? They expelled all the Jews. There was another area called Gush Etzion, east of Jerusalem. They expelled all the Jews. That's exactly what they did. Israel allowed 150,000 Arabs to remain in Israel. These are just facts, right? So, now, we're in the 1950s. We're getting somewhere. Source 13, okay? Source 13. Now we have the massive aliyah, mainly from the Middle East, from Arab countries. And let me share with you a fascinating fact. In the early 50s, the CIA predicted that Israel will collapse and implode internally economically. Because how can 600,000 people, most of them are refugees, absorb 1 million immigrants? How is that possible? Excellent question. Austerity. In Hebrew it's called tsena, which means that the whole country was on food stamps. So if you're a family of 5, so you get those stamps, and it says you get X amount of eggs and meat and bread per week. That's how people lived in the 50s in Israel. That's how it worked. There was the War of Suez in 1956. Nasser, who was the leader of the Arab world, the president of Egypt, he didn't allow ships to come from Africa to Israel, and Israel and he was also hiring German scientists to prepare certain missiles to reach Israel. Israel, with France and Britain, attacked Egypt and conquered the entire Sinai. And then Eisenhower wasn't happy, President Eisenhower in America, that we didn't tell him we're going to do that. And Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was really unhappy, and he wrote a letter to Ben-Gurion saying that unless Israel vacates the Sinai, he's going to aim missiles at Tel Aviv. And that could ruin your whole day if you live in Tel Aviv like Ben-Gurion did. So we actually went out of the Sinai. Until 67. 67, it's the same freaking story, if I can say the word freaking, if that's acceptable for a rabbi. It's May 1967. Israel is enjoying its Independence Day military parade. And suddenly Nasser does the same thing. He lets his army go into the Sinai. Let's look at the map. It'll make life more beautiful. The back side of the same page. What you see in this map, friends, is Israel after the War of Independence, before the 6-Day War. So the green part is Israel. The yellow part is the West Bank. Now, after the War of Independence, it's part of Jordan. This West Bank thing, until 67, until the 6-Day War, is part of Jordan. And these Palestinians, these guys had Jordanian citizenship. They had Jordanian passports.
Weren't they kicked out of Jordan?
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's in 1970. And the green, where Gaza is, where all the action is today, sadly, that was the red. I'm sorry, that was held by Egypt. So think about it. For almost 20 years, there is a state of Israel without the West Bank, without Gaza. Did the Arabs want peace with Israel? No. Now, Abba Ibn was one of Israel's greatest diplomats and an encyclopedic genius. You know what he called these borders of Israel that we're looking at? He called them the Auschwitz borders. Why did he use such a melodramatic term? He was a pretty balanced guy. Look at the numbers, right? That's Alex is into numbers, right? Much more than me. I wish I had your gift in numbers. So look, for example, at the coastal city of Netanya. You see Netanya, north of Tel Aviv? A 9-mile strip. That's the width of Israel, 9 miles. No, it's 15 kilometers, 9 miles. Crazy, right? 9 miles. That's why I told a few of you that God willing, should we have a mission to Israel, we'll go to Israel together. I'll invite you to my parents' home in Tel Aviv. On the 17th floor, you see the beach on one side. You walk to the other side of the roof, you see the West Bank. Do you know another country in the world where if you walk from one end of the balcony to the other, you cover the entire country? That's why... What? What is it?
Sorry, the Vatican.
The Vatican. Oh, that's a good one, yeah. Chile, too. Chile, too, is a very thin country. But they don't have such a complicated...
Argentina is not attacking Chile.
Yeah, exactly. So, so that's Israel before the 6-day war.
Are we dancing now?
Now, I like the tune. It's good. So now 1967. The Egyptians, and what happened? You know who was at the Sinai? UN peacekeeping forces. UTANT was the name of the UN Secretary General. And the Egyptians just told the UN peacekeepers, Yalla, yalla, taufu mipo, which is Hebrew for Yalla, yalla, get out of here. And the UN just went away. That's why whenever people say, don't worry, Israel, we'll let the UN buffer you, we laugh, right? And then Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, was the chief of staff. He recruited the reserves. There were weeks that are known as the waiting period, Tkufat HaAmtana, existential dread. The whole world thought Israel was on the brink of annihilation 22 years after the Holocaust. People like Sean Connery and Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, signing petitions, save Israel, save Israel. If you know the Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv, right next to it there is a park called Gan Ha'atzmaut. This whole park was being prepared to become a mass cemetery. Okay? And then Rabin actually had a breakdown. He went down to Sde Boker, to the Negev, to talk with Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion told him, you're crazy. Why did you recruit the reserve? Now we're going to have a war. And let's see what happened in that war.
Say that again?
Ben Gurion opposed the recruiting of reserves because he thought that Nasser was bluffing. But once we also recruited our reserves, so he thought it's going to, And Nasser became really a prisoner of his own rhetoric because he kept on. Now look at the empire called Israel, the last map. This is Israel after the 6-day war. The Sinai Peninsula, which is a synagogue in Foster City, California, not to be confused with Sinai Temple. The Sinai Peninsula is 3 times larger than the state of Israel. We conquered the Sinai Peninsula, right? And we conquered the West Bank, and there was a lot of money in that bank. And if you look above the Little Sea, which is the Kinneret, we conquered the Golan Heights. Now we're an empire. You know what that was? Very dangerous. You know what ensued? Hubris. It's the Greek sin of pride that will bring you to your downfall. We thought we were invincible. Basically, we became depressive manic. We were depressive before the 6-day war. We thought we were looking at another Holocaust. And then we became manic. We thought we are invulnerable. And I'm skipping after 6 years to the Yom Kippur War, and Egypt and Jordan attacked us by surprise, and we almost lost the war. In the early days, we thought we might lose the war. I'll never forget, I once saw a documentary. Moshe Dayan was addressing the people of Israel in black and white TV, and he said something, and I remember exactly what he said in Hebrew. So for those of us who know Hebrew, he said, אנחנו צריכים להמשיך ולהילחם עכשיו כעם שנלחם על חייו ואנחנו נלחמים על חיינו. He says, we must now continue to fight as a people fighting for its very existence. And we are fighting for our existence. We discovered later, political scientists, that Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, actually aimed nuclear missiles at Egypt and Syria. And that was part of the impetus for President Nixon to send us the airlift that kind of saved us. And ultimately, we finished the war. We were close to Damascus, we were close to Cairo, but thousands of Israeli boys died that should not have died. It was a catastrophe. It taught us a bitter lesson about the limits of war. Right? Yes.
Wasn't there a spy who was the son-in-law of Nasser?
Yes, if you want to watch The Angel on Netflix, it's a great movie. It has Tzachi Alevi from Fauda. And, but, you know, there is some artistic license in that movie. It's not completely accurate, but it's good enough, and it's a nice movie. I enjoyed it.
So did he tell them that they're going to attack?
Yes, sir.
I don't think Israel had nuclear warheads.
And they still didn't believe it.
I don't think Israel had nuclear warheads in 73.
I don't know. I think it may have, but I don't know. Israel's got its nuclear capacity in the 50s, yes.
Wasn't it part of the story that the Prime Minister knew that they were going to attack?
Yeah, they got. So what we were saying is that the son-in-law of the Egyptian president was a spy for Israel. And even he said, they're going to attack you in 2 days' time. And they sent it to Israel. The head of the Mossad met with him. And they deliberated. And by the time they recruited the reservists, it was only hours before the war. You know, it was a terrible thing.
But wasn't it part because the Americans told Israel, under no circumstances they wanted to attack first?
Well, Israel also feared being looked at as an aggressor. You know, the late Yoni Netanyahu, the prime minister's brother, his letters, the letters of Jonathan Netanyahu, it's a lot of political reportage he writes to his parents, who were, his father was a professor in America. And he tells a joke, and it's still relevant, depressingly enough, more than 50 years later. He says, a Brit, an American, and Israeli are captured by a tribe of cannibals. And a minute before they're boiled in a pot to be cooked and eaten, each one gets a last wish. So the American asks for burgers and fries. The Brit asks for fish and chips. The Israeli says, could you untie just my hands a little bit? You know, I want to feel my bloodstream. So they say, yeah, sure. He takes out a machine gun, takes out all the militant elements in the tribe. And the Brits and the Americans said, are you crazy? You had a machine gun? You waited to the last second? So the Israeli said, well, what, are you crazy? You want me condemned in the UN for boundless aggression? So that's Israel, you know, always worried, you know, about that perception. So now we're going to 1977. We're skipping Rabin's government of 74 to 77 in the interest of time, and for the last 5 minutes. And so 1977, Menachem Begin gets to power. It's the first time since Israel was established in 48 that the right gets to power, right? The political right. And like a lot of times in history, this flip happens. When Churchill became Prime Minister of England, people say he's a warmonger. De Gaulle was a general, but he got the French out of Algeria. There are a lot of cases like that. Only a hardliner right-winger like Nixon can go to China. So when Begin got to power, people say there's going to be a terrible war. Begin was a peacemaker. He went against his own gut, his own ideology, and Israel gave back the entire Sinai. Look at that amount of territory, the last map, to Egypt in exchange for peace. I think it's the only precedent in political history that a country gave a size 3 times the large of its state for peace. Why? Because as the rabbis say, Gadol Shalom, Shekol HaBarachot Krulot Bo. Great is peace, because all conceivable blessings are inherent therein. Now, in the 1980s, we had the Lebanon War of 1982. In a second, we'll just say what was the Lebanon War of 1982. The PLO was kicked out of Lebanon in 1970. And then they moved to Jordan. They tried to overthrow King Hussein of Jordan. And then they moved from there to Lebanon. And they were bombing Israel with Katyusha rockets. So Israel went into Lebanon in 1982. This was a really bad war for Israel. It was like the Israeli Vietnam. You know, Begin resigns in 1984 being very depressed from this war. It's a very tragic end for a great man. He really remained at home depressed for the rest of his life. He lived maybe another 6 years or so. Yitzhak Shamir became prime minister. 1987, the first Palestinian uprising in the West Bank. And Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, the chief of staff, victorious hero of the 6-Day War, former ambassador in Washington, prime minister 74 to 77, defense minister many years, gets to power in 1992. And I'm going to end with this. Let's look at the second map, okay? The one in which we have Israel in green. You know, Rabin, and with this we conclude, and many others like him, they look at the numbers and they say to themselves, okay, if there are 1.3 million Arabs in the yellow in West Bank, and 1.5, today 2 million in the red in Gaza, and we're 5-6 million Jews in the green, we're not going to be able to sustain a robust Jewish majority. So better to, from their perspective, better to try and find an accommodation with the Palestinians so that we can maintain the green part, which is 70% of the land of Israel, but with a very strong Jewish majority, rather than becoming a binational Arab-Jewish state. Make sense? That was the rationale for the failed, disastrous Oslo Accords that we will talk about next time. Neda, do you want to ask? Thank you.
I don't want to ask, but I would like to make the announcement that the last rabbi class on Israel has been switched from December 4th to December 5th.
Okay.
And thank you so much to Mitra and David for hosting tonight. We are looking forward to next time. So if anyone's interested, either come to me or to the rabbi or message us. Otherwise, we will find